titled Dead Body Breathing. So here's chapter 18. A biscuit was tossed into Louis's cell, breaking into bits on the floor. A tiny cup of weak tea was set on the windowsill. Louis gulped the tea and crawled around, picking up crumbs and putting them in his mouth. There was a rustle outside, and a Kwajalein native appeared. He greeted Louis cheerfully in English by name. Remember, he's been picked up, and they've been floating for 47 days. He gets picked up. He gets taken from the life raft and taken to Kwajalein, which is otherwise known as Execution Island. The man said that the castaways were the talk of the island. He was an ardent track fan, and when he'd heard Louis's name, he had come to meet the great runner. As Louis listened, bewildered, the man chattered on about sports, indifferent to Louis's plight. When he glanced at his watch and said he had to go, Louis stopped him. What had happened to the Marines that were held here? They're all dead, the man said. All prisoners of war held on Kwajalein are executed. As the man left, the guard looked challengingly at Louis, lifted a flattened hand to his throat, and did a slashing gesture. He pointed to the names on the wall, and then he pointed to Louis. The second day began. Phil and Louis lay in sweltering silence, expecting to be dragged out and beheaded. Louis developed explosive diarrhea, and cramps doubled him over. Flies, lice, and mosquitoes teemed on him. Heat was smothering. Down the hall, rats wallowed in Phil's waste bucket and skittered across his face. Guards stalked past, snarling and drawing the sides of their hands across their necks with cruel smiles. So they're walking past him all the time and going. Days passed, each bringing 2 or 3 rice balls tossed onto the floor and a tiny few cups of tea. Louis's diarrhea became bloody. He begged for water. The guard brought a cup. Louis, grateful, drew close to the door to drink. The guard threw scalding water in his face. Desperately dehydrated, Louis kept begging, and each time the response was the same, leaving Louis's face blistered. He knew that dehydration might kill him, and part of him hoped that it would. As he lay in misery, he heard again...
I need these team baseball players to go to the field house at this time. These team baseball players go to the field house at this time.
As he lay in misery, he heard again the singers from the raft. He let their voices wash over him, finding reason to hope. He held the song in his mind, praying intensely. He stared at the Marines' names, wondering who they were and how the end had come for them. He pulled off his belt, bent the buckle up, and carved his name beside theirs. The guards were in a fixed state of fury at the captives. Nearly every day they flew into rages that usually ended with Phil and Louis being spat upon and bombarded with rocks and lit cigarettes. Every day at gunpoint, Louis was forced to dance while his guards roared with laughter. They stabbed him with sticks and taunted him as he crawled around picking up bits of rice. Once, driven to his breaking point by a guard jabbing him, Louis yanked the stick away. He knew he might be killed for it, but under ceaseless humiliation, something was happening to him. He was losing his will to live. The crash of Green Hornet had left Louis and Phil in the most desperate physical hardship, without food, water, or shelter. But on Kwajalein, the guards deprived them of something deeper: dignity. This self-respect and sense of self-worth, the innermost armament of the soul, lies at the heart of humanness. To be deprived of it is to be dehumanized, leaving victims in a state of profound wretchedness and loneliness, unable to hang on to hope. So he's saying that when they were in the water and they were starving and whatnot, they still had human dignity for themselves. Like, they cared about themselves and what happened to them. But now that they're being treated cruelly and like animals, they can't take it anymore. It's making them lose their will to live. Few societies treasured dignity and feared humiliation as did the Japanese, for whom the loss of honor could merit suicide. This was probably one of the reasons why Japanese soldiers in World War II debased their prisoners with such zeal, seeking to take from them that which was most painful and destructive to lose. On Kwajalein, Louis learned a dark truth known to the doomed in the Hitler's death camps. The slaves in the American South and 100 of other generations of betrayed people Dignity is as essential to human life as water, food, and oxygen. The stubborn retention of it, even in the face of extreme physical hardship, can keep a man alive long past the point to which he should have died. The loss of it can carry a man off as surely as thirst, hunger, exposure, and asphyxiation, and with greater cruelty. In places like Kwajalein, degradation could be as lethal as a bullet. So once they lose their will to live, when you're not treated right, then you start to lose that will. Louis had been on Kwajalein for about a week when his cell door was thrown open and his guards pulled him out. Terrified, thinking he was about to be beheaded, he was marched into a building. Before him were Japanese officers sitting by a table heaped with food meant to entice him. Louis wasn't going to be executed. He was going to be interrogated. The ranking officer stared coolly at Louis. Which model of the B-24 did he crash in? Louis replied truthfully that it was a D model. The officer handed him a pencil and paper and told him to draw the plane. On Oahu, Louis had heard that the crashed D model had been captured by the Japanese. Knowing that they already had that plane in detail, he drew it accurately. His interrogators held up a photo of a D model. They'd been testing his truthfulness. What did he know about the E model? Nothing, he replied. It was a lie. The D model Superman had undergone upgrades that effectively made it an E. How do you operate the radar? Louis knew the answer, but he replied that he was a bombardier, so he wouldn't know. Told to draw the radar system, Louis drew an imaginary system so elaborate it was later written it resembled a ruptured octopus. The interrogators nodded. They moved on to his bomb site, which was top secret. How do you work it? You twist two knobs, Louis said. The officers knew he was lying and sent him to his cell without giving him any food. Suspecting he'd be brought back, Louis tried to anticipate questions. He thought of things that he could tell them and those that he had to keep secret. He invented lies and practiced telling them. Because he'd been partially truthful in the first session, he knew his captors would be more likely to trust his answers. One day, a new guard appeared at the door. Louis felt an upwell of dread. You Christian? The guard asked. Louis said yes, and the guard smiled. Me Christian. The guard reached into the cell and slipped 2 pieces of candy into Louis's hand, and then gave 2 pieces to Phil. A friendship was born. The guard's name was Kawamura, and he spoke almost no English. Each day he walked between the cells, drawing pictures of things and saying and writing their Japanese names. Louis and Phil would write and say the English names. They understood almost nothing that Kawamura said, but his gentle smile and goodwill needed no translation. It was life-saving. When Kawamura was off duty, another guard came. He launched himself at Louis, ramming a stick into his face as if trying to put out his eyes. When Kawamura saw Louis's bloody face, he asked who had done it, and then he sped away furious. Later, when he returned, he opened Louis's cell door a crack and proudly pointed outside. There stood the guard who had abused Louis, his forehead and mouth heavily bandaged. He never guarded that cell again. One day, Louis and Phil looked up to see angry faces pressed into their cell windows, shouting. Rocks flew in. More men came, screaming, spitting on the captives, hurling sticks. Louis balled up on the floor. On and on it went, some 90 men taking turns attacking the captives. At last it ended. Louis lay in a pool of spit and jumbled rocks and sticks, bleeding. Kawamura was distraught over what had been done to his friends. He told them the culprits were a submarine crew stopping over on the island, who learned that Americans were being held there. During interrogation, Louis complained about the attack. It was what you should expect, the officer replied. The interrogators asked Louis the number of aircraft, ships, and servicemen in Hawaii. Louis said he'd left Hawaii in May. Now it was August. He had no current information. He was sent back to his cell. Some 3 weeks after arriving in Kwajalein, Louis and Phil were suddenly dragged outside. They were taken to the front porch of the interrogation building where men in medical coats awaited them. Japanese gathered to watch. Louis and Phil were ordered to lie down. The doctors pulled out 2 long hypodermic syringes and filled each of them with a murky solution. Louis and Phil realized they were about to be used for an experiment. The doctors slid the needles into the captive's forearms and pushed the plungers. Within seconds, the port started gyrating around Louis. The doctor pushed more solution in, and the spinning worsened. Louis felt as if pins were being jabbed all over his body. He felt lightheaded. His skin burned, itched, and stung. Nearby, Phil endured the same ordeal. The doctors questioned the captives about their symptoms. Louis cried out that he was going to faint. The doctor withdrew the needle. The captives were returned to their cells. Louis's entire body was covered in a rash. For days, he was maddened by itching and burning. And when the symptoms subsided, he and Phil were again injected, this time with more solution. Again, they rolled through dizziness and burned with rashes. Then came a third experiment, then a fourth. At last, a full pint of fluid was pumped into their veins. They were lucky to survive. In their captured territories, the Japanese were using at least 10,000 prisoners of war and civilians, including infants, as test subjects for an unimaginably hellish experiment in medicine and biological and chemical warfare. Thousands died. I don't know how they survived that. Crazy. A pint is just a ton of fluid. It's 2 cups. Battered, emaciated, and sick, Louis was brought to interrogation for the final time. The officers pushed a map of Hawaii in front of him and told him to mark the air bases. Louis resisted, but the interrogators leaned hard on him. At last, Louis broke. He dropped his head and told them everything. The exact location of the bases, the number of planes. The Japanese were jubilant. They opened a bottle of cola and gave it to Louis, along with a biscuit and a pastry. It was all a lie. So Louis lying to them, and they don't know it. The bases Louis identified were fake airfields that he had seen when he was tooling around Hawaii with Phil. If the Japanese bombed there, the only planes that they would hit would be made of plywood. The captive's usefulness had been exhausted. At headquarters, the decision was finally made. Louis and Phil would be executed. On August 24th, the men gathered before Louis' cell, and once more he was pulled out. Is this it? He thought. Expecting to hear he was doomed, he was astonished to be told something else. He and Phil were now being sent by ship to Japan, where they'd be placed in a prisoner of war camp. At the last minute, the officers had decided not to kill them. It would be a long, long time before Louis learned why. On August 26, 1943, 42 days after arriving at Execution Island, Louis and Phil were led from their cells for the last time. Louis looked back, searching for Kawamura. He couldn't find him.